So now there's also choshim gizanut, freedom from racism. And then this one may actually be the simplest in the sense that there is a straightforward accusation from the more kind of secular-leaning left in Israel against the more rightward-leaning, more religious or more traditional parts of the Jewish population. They're all racist and we're not, and that makes us more morally correct, and it makes them untrustworthy, and we can't let them have power. We can't let democracy give them their way because they're racists. And we need the Supreme Court to be the knight in shining armor to protect us from their racism. And this really also has a basis in law in Israel because at this point, for a long time, there's been a law in the books that allows political parties or let's say, candidates for office in different political parties to be disqualified from running if it can be determined that they're racist. And every year, or rather every election, what basically happens is that it is the case that different kinds of petitions are brought to the courts on the basis of this law to disqualify some Jews who are accused of being racist and some Arabs who are accused of being racist, and the Jews who are too right-wing and therefore it is determined somehow that they said something was racist are frequently disqualified, such as most recently Michael Ben-Ari, and frequently or usually it is the case that Arab candidates who also are equally, if not more guilty of public statements that could be classified as racism, are at first disqualified on the basis of the law and then eventually exempted by some kind of intervention by the Supreme Court. And that's just kind of the dance or the ritual that happens over and over again with this law. And really, that's kind of always how it's been meant to work to some degree, in that the law was originally invented as a way for some politicians to use an ostensibly apolitical process to just disqualify some of their political opponents from running so that they have a better chance of winning themselves. And what it demonstrates is the moral bankruptcy of processes by which politicians are allowed to participate in the disqualification of other politicians from the possibility of running for office based on a highly malleable and subjective principle. So at one level, what this is referencing is just that there are people who say this is a stupid law that just allows one kind of political movement to disqualify opponents on the other side, from another movement, and the opposite doesn't happen because the Supreme Court favors one of those movements over the other one, and so we should not have this law. Not because we want everyone to be so much more racist, but because in practice the law is not actually being used to prevent racism. Even it's just being used to attack one political movement and strengthen another one in a way that doesn't correlate necessarily with racism. So that's one aspect of it. And then there's, let's say a more legitimate. I guess the first point I'm making is that, in a sense, some people don't want to change when they say choshim gizanut. What they're really referencing is they want to strike down this law. And we like that law because it makes the left more politically powerful by preventing certain people on the right from running, while not preventing people on the left from running. So let's keep it. But that's a very cynical, power-hungry thing. It's part of what's going on in the background there. But there's also, let's say, the more legitimate concern that there are actual things in the Torah that might be classified to the ear of a Westerner as racism, as we mentioned before. For example, that the Kohanim or the members of the tribe of Levi are considered by the Torah to have a different status with respect to certain laws of the Torah and with respect to what must be done on the Temple Mount. And whenever you create castes of people who have different opportunities and obligations, you're already doing something that doesn't really line up with a classic Western ideal of complete equivalence of all citizens of the state. And then this is a complicated issue because we're not really talking about the laws of the secular state here. We're talking about the Torah, but still, it is not unfair to say that some things in the Torah sound to the ear of a Westerner like what might be called racism. Also, like a law in the Torah saying that you can't have a king who doesn't come from the Jewish nation, right? That kind of restriction, although it makes sense in the context of the Torah, doesn't fly if you're thinking of it as a model for like, how do we, set requirements for who can or can't be president of the United States. You can say someone who's not 35 years of age cannot be president, but you can't say, oh, well, it only must be someone who is Irish or something like that. That wouldn't be constitutional unless you, in America, made a constitutional amendment, which is always an option there if you have enough democratic will for it. Interestingly, that's something in all these debates about democracy going on over here that no one really wants to recognize about how the American system functions, is that really it's just a matter of having enough democratic will and you can actually do anything in that system. You just have to pass a constitutional amendment. But leaving any of it, all of that aside, so the point with Choshim Gizanut is that there are things, it must be acknowledged about the Torah, that they don't sound like they fit easily into the straight up model of Western total equivalence of all kinds of people, before some aspects of the law, like at least according to the Torah law. However, now we have to ask the question, is that the same thing that we're talking about when people say, oh, well, you must completely oppose what you call gizanut? And when they say, what are we opposing? Why is it wrong? Obviously, the specter that they're trying to evoke is all the instances where gizanut, where racism has led to horrifying injustice and oppression, things like the slave trade and subsequent history of slavery of Africans in America, or what became African Americans in America, or then the subsequent devolution of that down into Jim Crow, or racism against Native Africans in apartheid South Africa by white colonists, et cetera, et cetera. So those kinds of things are what people are really trying to remind you of when they talk about racism, because they say, look at that, this was horribly unjust. There was a lot of violent oppression going on here. And of course, that must be what's coming down the pike in a way that couldn't possibly have a different basis or be something that there's more of an argument for, or something that isn't such a horrible injustice. If we just give, too much democracy, meaning the actual definition of democracy, like direct democracy, letting people vote and decide what the laws should be, that kind of thing. If we allow that to happen, all of these religious Jews who are too racist are going to, impose all of their racism on everyone. So that fear, at the end of the day, I think it is both an unsubstantiated, nasty stereotype that religious Jews in Israel are actually more racist than not religious Jews. Indeed, interestingly, there's plenty of evidence of another kind of racism in the composition of the Israeli Supreme Court, which has famously had almost no Sephardi or Mizrahi judges over the course of its entire history, because the court can veto effectively any proposed candidate for the court that it wants. And in the words of the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Aaron Barak himself, as much as they wanted to find qualified candidates of that background, they just simply couldn't with great frequency. And so it just didn't happen much. There are a few rare exceptions, but basically the court has been very nearly uniformly Ashkenazi, meaning, deriving from European background, and also not religious, again, with some exceptions. And of course, we would never suspect that there's any kind of unjust or unfair bias or bigotry on the part of the members of the Supreme Court that participated in those decisions that led to certain candidates being put forward or accepted. For what reason? Why? Why can't it be the case that Aaron Barak, in his own way, is some kind of racist? But there's the presumption in this kind of rhetoric that we all know who the racists are. The racists are the people who want judicial reform. The racists are the people who are religious or who are not, secular and Ashkenazi. But in fact, there's plenty of different kinds of bias to go around, and it's not at all clear that making sure the Supreme Court has as much power as possible frees us from all kinds of gizanut. And there are many kinds of Israelis who can attest to that. So it's both the case that it's a baseless and hypocritical accusation, and it's also the case that when we talk about the things in the Torah that themselves don't sound like they fit perfectly into an American model, and you could therefore accuse them of being quote unquote racist. If you study these laws and these issues in detail, they are not the same thing as the racism of Jim Crow South or apartheid South Africa, or for that matter, the pro-Malay majority discrimination against the Chinese minority of Malaysia, or all sorts of other kinds of racism that are institutionalized that exist around the world that sometimes get less attention. The Torah is, one can say, anti-racist in all instances that you could produce that are obvious, horrifying cases of racist injustice. And sometimes also the Torah requires things of us that someone might, off the cuff and without examining the issue, decry as racist, because in fact the Torah is subtle enough not to simply throw some lever every time two groups of people are not classified as being exactly identical in how they're understood before the law, because the Torah has an expressivity and subtlety in its understanding of morality and its understanding of nationhood and citizenship and obligation and holiness and all of these other things that it can encompass and embrace things that are unimaginable and invisible, in a sense, to a system as black and white and simple as, let's say, the American one by comparison.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.